Today we have with us two really special people. The first one is Shalini, who is a student in class 8th, and the second person is Nandini Singh Chatterjee, who is a cognitive neuroscientist, but now she's working with UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. Nandini, I wanted to ask you that your work covers language, music, and you basically had started from physics, then you entered into neuroscience. So, how has the journey been like for you?
So after I finished my PhD and was doing a postdoc in physics, I was my PhD was in complex systems, so I did a lot of math and computing there. And then I was working on again systems in spatiotemporal chaos. But my professor was not around too much. He was a professor emeritus, so he wasn't. I was in the US then for my postdoc, and he would kind of wander off. And I was very lonely in the lab, and I began to see what other labs were doing, and I discovered that a lot of the methods that I was familiar with in terms of looking at time series analysis, people were beginning to use in biology, and so I started to go in for those talks. And now the idea was I would try it out for a year or two, see if I learned something, if I was able to contribute to the field, and if yes, then great. Otherwise, I would come back to physics. Okay. But that at the age of 30 to want to try something new requires a little bit of courage, especially for a woman and a young mother. Okay. Uh, Now I feel it's not such a big deal. Now many more people do it. But that's how I took that change, and hats off to my postdoctoral advisor too, Mr. Frederick Thunison, who is a neuroscientist but was very excited by math and computing. So he always wanted to be more quantitative, and he would bring in those skills. So he kind of thought that this would be a nice match to try out. And that's how I went into neuroscience. And I just fell in love with the subject. I think there was just like so much new to learn. And I think all of us are fascinated with the brain that after there was no looking back.
You were working for some time in National Brain Research Center, and then now you're currently working at UNESCO
Yeah,
NGIB. So, what is it that the institute do, and what are you doing? What is your role there?
Okay.
Currently? So, Shalini she also has a few questions
Sure.
to ask. So, I would request Shalini to now ask her questions.
So MJIP is one of UNESCO's 6 Category 1 institutes in the world. It's the first one in the Asia Pacific, okay? And it's focused on education for peace. Unlike other institutes in the world that focus on peace, the founding director of MGIP decided to take a slightly different approach. And his thought was that how can we cultivate peaceful mindsets? Okay, it's you can't really teach people peace. You have to feel peaceful in order to behave peacefully, because uh, in some ways you can think of peace as an equivalent to a calm emotion. So if you are angry in your brain, it's going to be very difficult for you to be peaceful in your behavior, because ultimately your behavior is determined by your brain. Okay? So, what is it that we know that can cultivate peaceful mindsets? Was his thought. And the biggest example there was the person behind whom this institute was named, and that was the Mahatma. Okay, so a lot like the way Gandhi talked about compassion, about non-violence, the ability to first recognize what is the emotion you feel, and then uh, finding ways to manage it is what MGIP is really focused on. We now know it as social and emotional learning, and a large part of the human brain is actually devoted to being social. Being social is rewarding for us. Okay, it's rewarding because it gives rise to different emotions, but it can also give rise to a lot of anger and disagreement, and that results in violence. Okay? So we now know, because of advances in neuroscience and a whole branch called contemplative practice, that you can learn to recognize from your body too when you are experiencing different emotions. So this impacts learning in a very big way in the classroom. Okay. So how can we bring in these skills in the classroom so that teachers can use them? You might have a fantastic teacher who comes and talks about very exciting things in the classroom. But if a child sitting in the classroom is just has a lot of anxiety for a reason he or she does not know. It could be that when I step out, that boy is going to beat me up. Or I'm just anxious because in the morning when I came on the bus, there was a lot of rush and I got pushed around. There is no way the brain is going to be available for learning. But we now know that by doing simple things, and these are sensory tasks, it could be something as simple as getting all children to sit down for 2 minutes and just breathe quietly. Counting your breath for 1 minute can be extremely calming as a process. You might find it very funny and stupid, but try it out. Okay. And so, how to make classrooms such that they are amenable to learning, how to make teachers sensitive to these aspects. If a teacher can exhibit empathy, so if the teacher can say a positive word to the child, that activates a reward network and the child is more willing to learn. So, unless the brain attends, it cannot learn. You can have the most fantastic things happening in the classroom, but the brain will not learn. So, how do we bring these practices in the classroom? And how do we teach children from a young age social and emotional skills so they can be in charge of their well being? Just like you teach children to read and write, you teach them how to manage their well being. It's a core competency that we think should come into the classroom. That's what MGIP tries to do.
Shalini she also has a few questions
Sure.
to ask. So I would request Shalini to now ask her questions.
So, my first question is, how did you decide to work for understanding of dyslexia? And do you know someone with dyslexia?
During my work at NBRC, I was studying language and speech development, and NBRC then got an MRI scanner. Okay, and because I was a physicist, I understood how the scanner worked. I was encouraged to start doing now experiments in cognition. Okay, and we started to look at reading as a process. When I was started to understand reading, there were kids who were coming in from schools who were participating in our experiments, and there I began to see that not all kids were reading the words that we gave them to read. And so I was curious as to why is it that some kids are able to read and some kids are not able to read. And I started to read more about differences in reading, and that's how I got to know about dyslexia. So I did not know about dyslexia till about 2007 or 8. It's only then that I started reading about it, and that's when I realized that people in India were not only not aware of dyslexia, there were no tests available to diagnose dyslexia, and that's what led to the development of DALI. Because I was like, there is no test. How do parents and teachers know why a child is not able to read? Parents and teachers are just hitting kids or punishing them because they are not able to read, not realizing that the child might have an issue because of a difference in brain wiring. I had many more friends who, when I started to tell them about dyslexia, actually willingly came forward and said that I have dyslexia and I have coped with it in these ways. So I know a couple of fairly grown up people who are very proud to say that they have dyslexia, and they celebrate the way how they look at problems and questions differently. They might not have a superpower, so they're not like superlative at something, but they just look at solutions differently. And now, of course, I know you, who I know has this tremendous superpower of kindness. You know, it's very difficult for people to be kind, Shalini.
Thank
And you have it ingrained in you.
Can you tell us about DALI and your new app?
So DALI is Dyslexia Assessment for Languages of India, which I developed at NBRC, and it was meant for teachers to screen kids in their classrooms based on some instances they saw in the classroom, and then an assessment battery which could be done by a psychologist. But whilst after we validated DALI, there were two things that were bothering me. One was it was not addressing dyscalculia. And many parents were coming up to say that we don't have anything for dyscalculia. The second thing was I realized teachers were also very biased. Okay, now whenever you're filling out a questionnaire it's which is based on behavioral rating, it's the teacher's opinion about whether the child has something or not. And I realized teachers could be biased. Just because a kid was not doing very well in the exam, they might be rating those kids. Whereas a performance-based app, there's where the child actually interacted with the application and did different kinds of tasks, actually made the process much more fun. So now what we have uh, sort of taken the way forward is we do what is called triangulation. So the teacher fills out a set of questions, the child does a series of tasks, and the parent also fills out a series of questions. And then we try and see whether the child actually needs intervention and can then go for additional work. And I'm actually wanted to make a very big push that this should happen at a very young age. When children enter school itself, we should have universal screening for different strengths and weaknesses that children might have. Not wait for them to fail, but use this more as a prevent.
Okay. Are there any other conditions that you are interested to work on?
Yes, I have a big interest in autism, which is also an area I worked on quite a bit, in the sense that many kids with autism respond very well to music and not so much to speech. And I had a brilliant PhD student who actually worked on it to show that when you're looking at something called sung speech, so if I say khana khane aao instead of khana khane aao, a child with autism will actually respond to that khana khane aao. And when you look at the brain, when they are listening to that, you can see how there is a difference in connectivity. So the connectivity is preserved because the information is slowed down, and that melodic nature to it, because of the changes in pitch, is something that they are able to perceive and they respond. Okay? Otherwise, kids with autism might not even respond to that. So that's something we leveraged a little bit and developed actually an intervention where some kids who had absolutely no verbal speech and would not make eye contact, when the people doing intervention actually used this method, they began to find that eye contact improved, and some language also began to build around the ages of 2 to 3 years. So the more non-verbal you are, there is now very strong evidence to show that music is something that is something that's very attractive and appealing to kids with autism, because music has a sense of regularity which speech does not have, and kids with autism always take to something which has a higher level of predictability.
Okay. Is dyslexia or other learning disabilities genetic?
Dyslexia certainly is. Dyslexia is, so is dyscalculia, and in some cases autism too. Okay, dyslexia and dyscalculia are much more than autism. Okay, because in dyslexia and dyscalculia, we now know that it runs across families. There is a lot of data to be able to support that, and so there are a number of families who, when their children are quite young, if they acknowledge their dyslexia, they will tell um, the teacher and the learning environment that our child needs additional support, and start providing it early on rather than again waiting for the child to fail. So you don't want to try and figure out as soon as possible that the child needs help. And I actually begun to think that the methods that we use for teaching in dyslexia are not that different from what we teach in typical kids. We just slow down the amount of information and the rate at which we provide it. If we started to assume as if our entire class is dyslexic, everybody would benefit. The typical child and the child who might be at risk for dyslexia. So I think those should become the norm methods for teaching basic or foundational skills.
So, what you just said, would that be an inclusive environment that we talk about?
Certainly one approach to inclusion. Some kids might pick it up faster, some can could take might take a little longer. But we also know that kids are able to help each other in very nice ways. So one kid might pick up learning sound letter mapping very quickly, but another kid might learn a certain kind of jump whilst doing sports very well. Another kid might pick a tune very well. So if kids begin to help each other in these ways, they might actually end up being a much more inclusive classroom where you recognize each other's strengths, okay, and as well as challenges, and help each other, rather than a purely competitive environment where the only objective in life is to stand first, okay, which actually does nothing for you later on in life, okay. But working together and learning to recognize each other as different people does make a big difference in leading a happier life and having better relationships. And I think these are life skills that always hold you in good state. I say this in hindsight, but I think at least we should pass on that information to the next generation.
So one last question before we wrap up. So do you have any message for parents, teachers, and in general the public for this Dyslexia Awareness Month?
I think if the only message that I might have is celebrate yourself and your child rather than comparing your child. Okay. There is a lot of gratitude we need to have for a lot of the things that we have. And we are so busy chasing things we don't have that we forget to appreciate what we have. I just think it's so much more important to be happy and kind than to worry about getting 100 out of 100 in an exam. So, if parents and teachers are out there and your child comes home, ask them what good you did for somebody today rather than how many marks you got in a test today.
Thank you so much, Nandini.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Shalini.